Hello, my name is Terry Stewart, and welcome to the Fundamentals of AI, Systems Design 522, taught at the University of Waterloo in the fall of 2023. This is Lecture 0, just sort of the introductions and definitions for the course. Okay, so what are we going to do? We want to just start with a little bit of background on who I am. So I am a senior research officer at the National Research Council Canada. So that's Canada's government research lab. There's about 2,000 researchers scattered across Canada, most of them in Ottawa. I'm physically at the NRC Waterloo Collaboration Centre. So there's about 5 of us researchers housed at the University of Waterloo, collaborating together with Waterloo researchers and Waterloo students, focusing on topics of AI, cybersecurity, and Internet of Things. As far as what I actually tend to do is, so I self-identify as a cognitive scientist. I'm really interested in how brains work, how minds work, how do people work. And the way that structures my research is I tend to be very interested in trying to investigate brain systems, trying to figure out what algorithms are underlying these various different physical, biological systems. But then in order to test those algorithms, I tend to build computer simulations of them, run those computer simulations, see whether the behavior looks like the biological systems. And then sort of as almost a side effect of that, a lot of the times when you sort of identify what it is, how it is that brains are working, those can lead to some very energy efficient AI solutions. Because brains are really, really good at what they do, and they tend to use a lot less energy than a lot of standard computer science approaches. So that aspect there of doing this biologically inspired AI, that's the part that sort of pays the bills. That's the part that, okay, here is a good reason to fund this research. It's much easier to get funding when we focus on that sort of side of things rather than the global goal, the thing that I'm actually interested in, which is I just want to understand how minds work, how brains work. Anyway, so that's sort of where I am right now. So it's a government research lab position, full-time researcher collaborating with professors and students at the University of Waterloo. And so that's why I'm somewhat suitable for teaching this course. In addition, if I go back to sort of history of how I got here, so I did do my undergrad in systems design at the University of Waterloo, and even back then I was sort of interested in this direction. I did the cognitive science option, took a lot of the AI and cognitive science type courses. I then went on and did a Master's of Philosophy in Computer Science and AI at the University of Sussex, that's in the UK, in Brighton. That actual work ended up sort of being sort of doing experimental psychology on robots. It's kind of fun. But then I came back to Canada and did a PhD in cognitive science at Carleton University, where it's very focused on just how should you be using large-scale computational simulations as part of research into how minds work. That sort of somewhat naturally ended up coming back to Waterloo for my postdoc. So I spent 10 years as a postdoc with Chris Eliasmith, who's also in systems, at the University of Waterloo at the Center for Theoretical Neuroscience. And what we did there, among a whole bunch of things that we did there, was a long postdoc, but one of the big things was developing a computer simulation of the brain called SPAWN, which is the world's largest functional brain model. So meaning it's a computer simulation where the parts of the computer simulation sort of map onto neurons in the brain and organized in different brain areas. So it's all with spiking neurons with different neurotransmitters connecting them. But then it's also functional in the sense that it's able to do a bunch of tasks. So it's able to do simple tasks like I show it a list of numbers, then ask it what the fourth number was in that list. And it sort of models all the different processes from vision, that sort of memory task, figuring out how to follow the command, and then even sort of doing the muscle control to move its arm to write out an answer. Yeah, building large brain simulations, kind of exciting. That also led to a spin-off company called Applied Brain Research that sort of focuses on this energy-efficient AI direction. And also as part of all of that work, I ended up spending a lot of time with neuromorphic hardware. So that is computer chips that are sort of focused on, can I do large-scale brain simulations, or sort of biologically inspired computer chips is maybe the right way to do it. And the idea is that those would be computer chips that are much more suited for doing large-scale AI models than sort of traditional computer chips approach. So building computer chips that are good at doing doing neuron-type simulations, with the goal of sort of bringing down the power consumption needed for these really large models, because brains are just way more power efficient than normal digital hardware. Okay, so that's sort of background of where I'm coming from. What do, fundamentals of AI, what are we going to sort of do out of this course? So my goals in this course, one of them is just to demystify AI. So just sort of, all right, there's lots of different AI systems out there. Let's demystify them. Let's understand what the components are that sort of build them up. There is a, there's a lot of sort of both complicated math and a lot of sort of things that just, people try this and this kind of works, that sort of goes along with the AI direction. But I think there are some fundamentals that we can pick out and that can let us understand things a little bit more than, say, in this XKCD comic there on the side, which has a certain amount of truth to it, and I hope by the end of the course you'll understand. There's certainly a certain amount of truth on the side there of just, all right, we're just going to do a bunch of linear algebra and hope. There's a little bit more that we can say. We can do a little bit more in terms of, don't just randomly change things and hope they can get better. We can do a little bit better than that. Still a certain element of truth to that on the side. But I want to demystify this process of what's going on inside the sort of standard AI models that might be that are currently being used. Also, I want by the end of this course for you to be able to, given a task, at least sort of apply suitable basic AI models to this task. What I mean by basic, a lot of modern AI starts doing things like requiring billions of data points. So like, the modern large language models are just trained on like all the text on the internet. That sort of level of things, actually doing it requires a lot of more specialized technical skills, and sort of outside of the scope of this course. I want us to understand those processes. I want us to, at least have a high-level understanding of what's going on with those sorts of modern AI tools. But in terms of what you'll be able to practically apply by the end of this course, fine. Not that sort of extreme deep learning stuff by the end of this course, but there's a lot of other techniques that are sort of applicable in lots and lots of other domains that sort of aren't quite that extreme, that I do want us to be able to apply by the end of this course. Okay, and sort of all the AI that gets, a little bit less attention these days because of those extremely large systems. Okay. There is a separate course on the deep learning. It's currently Systems 599 deep learning, if you're interested in those, but that's not going to be the emphasis on this course. Still want us to understand what's going on in deep learning, but it's not the emphasis here. All right, so that's our goals. All right, AI. How are we going to structure this course? Today I just want to do sort of what do we mean by AI? Let's give us some background. We'll then get into sort of the core tools and techniques. What things actually count as core is always a moving target, but we will at least give you a mathematical basis for a lot of the core techniques. I'm going to put a little more emphasis on tools that are still in common use. There's fads in AI, and people focus on some things and then focus on other things, but we'll attempt to focus on tools that are in common use. Again, I want to have these connections, or how do those tools relate to modern AI techniques, and in particular deep learning. So that's going to be sort of the core chunk of the course, sort of the first half, first 2/3, something like that. We'll then want to spend a little bit of time on validation and measurement. That'll come up throughout the course, but we'll actually have a section where we just focus on that. How do we validate these things? How do we measure them? How do we know whether or not they're getting better or getting worse, or can be applied to new situations? That's also going to tie really closely into the ethical use of AI, and other sort of considerations of how to apply these things. And then the final chunk of the course, I want to start just sort of branching into other topics. So it's both sort of fundamental techniques that are underemphasized, things that are out of favor right now, connect to other research areas like cognitive modeling, and sort of looking at new promising tools that might be coming up. But that'll be sort of just a grab bag of things at the end. The course syllabus has sort of a breakdown of what my topics are planning to be. That's sort of those extra things at the end. That'll be, subject to change. We'll see what things go on in there. That's also, if we get a little bit behind on some of the lectures, some of those might disappear. That chunk, that sort of the extra topics chunk at the end, is subject to change. But that's sort of the basic structure. As far as grading goes, we're going to do 4 assignments and a final project. The assignments, yes, the assignments are going to start at, the first one is going to come out at the end of next week. There's going to be sort of one assignment every 2 weeks. They will be Python programming assignments. Basically, you will implement these things. There'll be a little bit of short answer questions, but you'll be implementing these things, running them. Sometimes you'll be implementing them from scratch. Sometimes you will be using existing tools. I am quite happy for people to work together and discuss when working on those assignments. In fact, I highly encourage people to do that. I do need everyone to write their own assignment. So you will have to answer the questions yourself, and write your own code for the assignments. Copying someone else's code or answers word for word does not count as writing your own assignment. Fine. But in any case, working together, discussing is probably pretty necessary. So anyway, there's going to be those 4 assignments. Final project, start thinking about it nowish in terms of groups. You can have a group of up to 2. You can also perfectly fine doing it on your own. Basically what it's going to be is pick a problem, apply AI to the problem, hopefully apply multiple techniques to the problem, modify the AI thing, adjust different aspects of the approach that you're using, analyze the results, write it up as a paper. Okay. All right, so that's going to be the overall schedule. We'll see how close we stick to that schedule. I'm hopeful, but we'll see. All right. Where are we going to go from here? I want to start with a brief history of AI. This is going to be sort of a highly biased, somewhat personal history of AI. There's lots of things that could be added here, but these are the things that jump out for me in terms of what brings us to this point in artificial intelligence. So the overall idea of building a thing that's both artificial and intelligent has certainly been around for a really long time. So pretty much every ancient culture has a history of building automata, of building mechanical things that sort of exhibit some lifelike behaviors. Ancient Greeks, ancient China, lots of examples of those that have been out there. Sort of somewhat more recently, you start seeing things in fiction, like Frankenstein, building an artificial living creature, and interesting complications that may or may not arise there. There's also Rossum's Universal Robots, which was where the word robot comes from. It's anyway, but this sort of history, these ideas of building an artificial thing, although both the Frankenstein and Rossum's Universal Robots, it was more of a sort of organically based rather than mechanically based, but still these ideas have been definitely out there for a very long time. People have been fascinated with building artificial intelligent systems. In terms of actually sort of making concrete, sort of the sort of modern ones, I would start with W. Gray Welter's Tortoises, sort of 1948. These were really simple robots, like built out of vacuum tubes that were just sort of, like just a little tiny, not tiny, but, a foot in diameter. Little robots that would sort of, they could, run towards lights or run away from lights and sort of, chase after each other. Very simple behaviors, again, built out of vacuum tubes and like old school analog electronics. This is also about the sort of time where we get things like Alan Turing's the Turing test, where we get this idea of, fine, if we're going to be building these artificial, how do we know if we have built artificial agents? How do we know if they're intelligent? And focusing on the idea of, look, really it's about behavior. If it acts like a person, that's sort of really what we're looking for. Or, like avoiding this question of, oh, is it truly intelligent, and more focusing on, hey, look, let's measure it in a certain way and simply say, if I can't distinguish this from a person, then that's going to count as intelligent. Sort of laying out that sort of argument. 1948, 1950. This is also around the era where the first chess and checkers programs start existing. So the first sort of game playing. These were not very good. So these were sort of, they could like be sort of amateur level. Again, 1951, very simple computers these are running on. It's more sort of, if you're in this situation, do this move. Sort of programming. A little bit more fancier than that. But the very, we're trying to get these sorts of game playing things right at a very early stage. And then sort of perhaps a marker of really the beginning of AI, or certainly definitely the beginning of the term AI. So the term artificial intelligence came out of the Dartmouth workshop. This is in New Hampshire, Dartmouth College, in 1956, where basically all of the people who were working on all of these things just all got together and sort of defined where we want this whole field to be going. What are the interesting challenges? What's feasible as people are getting excited about this? So 1956, the term artificial intelligence is sort of defined right then, and we start getting a fairly, quite a takeoff of exciting results after this point. So we start getting into things like the general problem solver. So this is a computer program where you can just define a problem and it will go solve it. So things like, here's a logical statement of all people are mortal. This is a person, therefore they are mortal. That's, I can do logical reasoning on these sorts of symbolic statements like that. I can take a puzzle where, I can only move these blocks to these locations, and I have to slide this around the other thing, and it will go and figure out, here's the sequence of moves that you need in order to solve this puzzle. That sounds like intelligence. That's really exciting. Wow, okay, we've got things that can start solving problems here. 1958, we get Perceptrons, which is the first, well, maybe not the first, but certainly the first step towards sort of modern, what we would call neural networks. And this idea of having a whole bunch of neurons with a whole bunch of connections between them, or a whole bunch of components with a whole bunch of connections between them, and adjusting the connections between them in order to do some task. We will talk a lot more about that in the next lectures. This, and they had machines there that would do. You could show it a picture of a letter, and it would recognize what letter it was. And this, big physical, computers specifically for this. It's a sort of 1950s style computer, big giant computers, but could recognize digits. We're getting these things right off the bat. A little bit later, 1964, we get things like ELIZA, which is the first sort of chatbot, where you can sort of, you can type text and it'll give you text back. And this ELIZA in particular, one of the standard things that was done with it is it would pretend to be like a psychiatrist, and would sort of, you could tell it about your problems, and it would go like, oh, gee, and how does that make you feel? And sort of give it a dialogue. And there's where we start getting the first reports of people sort of treating the artificial agent as like, oh, no, that was a really helpful dialogue, or oh, no, I'm getting interesting feedback, or doing interesting connections. Or at least briefly, there's at least examples of it briefly fooling people into thinking it's a real agent, or a real person typing back and forth to you. So that's happening there. SYDE is so similar, you're typing back and forth to the agent, but this is a case where they've got this little simulated world where there's like blue blocks on top of yellow blocks on top of green blocks and beside an orange block, and you can tell it things like, oh, can you put the blue block on top of the green block? And it'll go, oh, but there's like already a yellow block on top of the blue block, so now I've got to like move the yellow block off the blue block so that now I can move the blue block onto. And so it could sort of combine this reasoning process with a little simulated world, and you could tell it things, and it would go do things in that world. So all sorts of cool things happening in the 60s, end of 60s. There's this book called Perceptrons. It sort of like also analyzes the whole state of this sort of neural networky field and sort of explores, okay, what are the capabilities? What are the possibilities of this approach? All sorts, so, it's trying to put things on an interesting mathematical basis and sort of defining the limits of where you can go with these things. All sorts of cool excitement in this field. And we're also in this time frame getting a bunch of really interesting quotes, so sort of just to give a sense of the excitement going on. So 1958, Simon and Newell, within 10 years, a digital computer will be the world's chess champion. Within 10 years, a digital computer will discover and prove an important new mathematical theorem. 1950. All right, they missed that prediction a little bit. Eventually, chess program did become the world's chess champion. They missed the deadline by a little bit. I think it's an interesting question about whether even now we've got discover and prove an important new mathematical theorem. Important being the key word there. But that was a sort of excitement. A little bit later in that time frame, 1970, people are saying from 3 to 8 years, we will have a machine with the general intelligence of an average human being. 1970. So, all right, so highlighting that there, just this prediction that we're going to have AI that is as intelligent as a human has been around for a long time. 1970. Certainly my entire lifetime, people have been predicting that sort of statement. And so, I don't know. To me, that's at least an indication of going into some of these modern predictions with a bit of skepticism. That's a whole separate discussion we will talk about later in the course, or maybe just we'll talk about in the tutorial periods. In any case, that's the sort of state of excitement that was happening in sort of 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. And then what happens after that? Yeah, that not quite. That didn't quite turn out as well as people were hoping for. Um, and one of the key problems there seemed to end up being, or one way to phrase it is, a lot of these initial examples that people had worked really well on small toy problems, but didn't generalize up to something that's actually useful to anyone. Okay, so I think there was all sorts of interesting stuff in sort of useful in terms of understanding more about how people work and how and how cognition can work. But in terms of it actually being useful to industry and making anyone any money, not quite. Now, when does that start changing? So, 1980, exactly where you want to put this line is a little bit fuzzy. But I like 1980 in that it's the first situation where we start getting expert systems that are useful to industry. So what's an expert system? So the XCon, it's so 1980. An expert system ends up being sort of a whole bunch of if-then rules sort of added together into a big giant program that somehow does something useful. To be a little bit more concrete. When you were ordering big giant computers in the 1980s, sort of, and you wanted computers with particular components and parts, and you say, okay, these are the things that I need for my installation. These are these room-sized computers. It would always be something like, if you want this component, then you're going to need this cable. Oh, but if you want to connect it to this other component, then you're going to need this adapter and this other cable. And the DEC computing company was losing tons of money in that this was such a complicated set of dependencies that they'd sell a computer and then it would get delivered and you're like, oh, you're missing this cable and this cable and this cable. And then they'd have to wait for those to get shipped out and all that sort of stuff. So this expert system ended up sort of being a combination of something in the order of like 2,500 rules of these dependencies and these structures and whatnot that would just sort of automate that whole process. And ended up saving them tons of money. So like the argument was saving them something in the order of like $25 million a year or something. And that sort of, here's an actual use for these big collections, things like the general problem solver, things like these sorts of conditions where I'm like, okay, I can put a bunch of these structured rules and have the computer go and figure out what the right thing to do is in this situation. Okay, so that actually becomes sort of useful artificial intelligence. And that seems an interesting trigger point to me for this next phase of AI. This idea of building up this sort of sets of rules and knowledge about a situation starts getting expanded on. There's a project called SYDE that starts in 1984 and is still ongoing, where the project is to gather together all the sort of common sense knowledge in the world. So you're like, like simple things like, if you put a heavy object on top of a round object, then it'll sort of fall off. Or if you, Wednesday comes after Tuesday, or you need wings to fly, or flying, most things that fly have wings. Maybe that's the right way to do it. Statements like that, and trying to build all of these together in one big giant knowledge base so that you can actually do interesting reasoning on that. Also, a lot of focus in this time on this sort of symbolic knowledge, this sort of how do we take high-level information and code it in a computer and then do reasoning on that. This is also about the time where we start getting fancier neural network learning rules. So the backpropagation learning rule, which is sort of the core thing that lets neural networks work, gets sort of solidified at about this time. the core ideas had been around all over the place, but sort of highlighting, oh, hey, look, this is a way to make larger neural networks work. That gets established in sort of 86. And this is also about the time where we get computers that are not chess champions yet. So Deep Thought in 1989, so it's definitely there's definitely still people who beat it, but sort of at the it's playing now at a sort of a grandmaster level. Right? It's not, there's still people that can beat it, but it's pretty darn good at this point. Awesome. Then what happens? So this is a little bit more controversial. The way I've drawn that line down is a little bit more controversial. And I think one way to phrase it is this quote from Nick Bostrom in 2006, pointing out that a lot of cutting edge AI has filtered into general applications, often without being called AI, because once someone becomes useful enough and common enough, we don't call it AI anymore. So that sort of happening. So like, there's a lot of techniques that are now sort of being used in lots and lots of domains, and it's and these ideas, these expert systems are being used in lots of situations, but it's not a hot topic during this thing. It's just something like, okay, we're using this as a tool. There's a couple cool things that come out in this era. I really like the TD gammon. So this is computers playing backgammon. And in particular, this is the first time where computers playing games started finding tricks that experts had not seen before, and that had actually changed how experts played backgammon. So that's one thing. This is also the time when support vector machines start being developed, which again we will talk about in more detail. They end up improving on the sort of classification capabilities of a lot of AI models in an interesting, sort of mathematically rigorous way. This is also the era where we finally do get chess. Actually, yes, the world's chess champion is now a digital computer. This is Deep Blue, 1997. Big, giant, specialized computer specifically designed to use pretty much the old school algorithms from the 50s, 60s, 70s, but just really, really fast and really dedicated computer to let's just push those algorithms as hard as we can. It was not using neural networks. It was using these sorts of classical symbolic approaches. Then that is digital computer is now the world's chess champion around this point. But it's not a this era gets called the second AI winter. This is the first drop there is the first AI winter. The second drop there is called the second AI winter. People aren't calling it AI. It's not a hot topic, but perhaps a lot of the techniques are still that were developed sort of in this general range are being used in lots of different places. What starts changing to bring us in the modern era? I mark it with this paper. It's not quite the development of deep belief networks, but a fast learning algorithm for deep belief networks by Jeff Hinton, University of Toronto, 2006. It's sort of the first time that big neural networks, that we show that we can really train big neural networks and do things, useful things with them. So I put it on that paper. Other people would put a little bit later with, say, AlexNet in 2012. AlexNet is the first network that you show it an image, it tells you what's in the image, and it's somewhat decently good at it. Okay. Before 2012, there was just nothing even vaguely useful in that domain. I mean, lots of people were trying doing these tasks, but it certainly wasn't at a level that would be sort of commercially useful. AlexNet ends up being a huge step forward. It's a deep neural network, and again, we will perhaps talk about these. We'll certainly talk about that more later on. And then this starts getting us into sort of the modern era of AI. We start getting neural machine translation, so translating text between two different languages. That starts actually working pretty nicely with these neural network type approaches. we start getting into the whole era of deepfakes and using generative adversarial networks, or GANs, to generate new images that seem real. So we get AlphaGo. So, all right, fine. People have, computers are now won at chess. Computers win at Go. AlphaGo does a pretty darn good job and starts being world leader at Go. And then even farther, AlphaGo 0 ends up saying, not only could we beat the world champion at Go, but we can do it without ever seeing any human play. So AlphaGo 0 ends up learning to play Go entirely by playing against itself, and ends up doing it at a, ends up defeating all human players. What else do we get into? GPT, which lots of people now know about. So sort of this idea of just being able to type text and getting text back, so being able to generate new text, and having that sort of conversational capability. That starts coming out. DALL-E, so being able to describe a picture you want, and it draws that picture for you in different styles. And then, of course, ChatGPT. Well, I guess very late last year, but pretty much all 2023. I think it came out in like December of 2022. That, all right, there is something fundamentally, quite intelligent about these sorts of systems. That sort of brings us into the modern era. Of course, there's this interesting question about where it goes next. That's always a fun discussion. People have been worried. So people in this field have been worried about a third AI winter. But they've been worried about that since like I've been hearing worries about that since pretty much all the 2010s. Maybe it does end up being more sort of, oh, right, these are the tools that now exist. We're now going to just use them all over the place. Whether or not we call it AI is going to be an interesting question. It could be that AI has now become such a strong buzzword that now that term ends up sort of losing its previous negative connotations that perhaps it had in that sort of 90s era. All right. That's a bit of a whirlwind sort of vague summary of the sort of key points of how I sort of see where we are right now. Just sort of, it's not quite 100 years, but that history of AI. And we'll hit a lot of these components. Again, we're not going to focus on actually implementation aspects of deep networks. We'll talk about, we should be able to get understanding of what's going on in these deep networks, but we're going to focus more on pretty much things up to sort of the 2012 sort of era, and see where we can go, see how far we can get with that. That'll give us the fundamentals to then understand what's going on in these sorts of more modern approaches. All right, so that's my wacky history. What is it that we want these systems to do? So what is artificial intelligence? Why these particular, why am I including these things as part of AI and not other things that I could have listed on there? So yeah, fair question. So what do we want? It just seems to be like this. There's just all sorts of different tasks we want them to do. We want to just do stuff that people do. And what the hell does that mean? Write an essay, play games, discover truth, fool people into thinking it's human, do my chores. Do the chores, it's worth highlighting, the term robot does come from the Czech word for robota, which is forced labor. So there's definitely connections in that domain of what it is that we want these things to do. Those are really hard things to sort of quantify and measure. And one thing that we're going to want to do in order to make sort of progress is to figure out, okay, well, can we like define those tasks, or like what's a clearer task to start with? And one way to sort of structure how we're going to be thinking about AI is we're going to start thinking of this using the sort of terminology of function approximation, which is arguably the core of a lot of AI. What do we mean by function approximation? Well, I've got some input X, I'm going to shove it into some black box, and I'm going to get some output Y. I mean, arguably, this describes like a lot of things. I'm taking some input, shoving in, I'm getting some output Y. And if I've got a box that does that, well, like it is, whatever it is that's inside that box is doing is computing some sort of function. Okay. And really what I want with a lot of AI is I want that box to do something, but I don't know exactly what that function is. Okay. But I might have some sort of, examples of X and Y, or like, oh, for this X, I want this Y, and for this other X, I want this other Y, or here's just a bunch of X values, and I don't even know what I want for these Ys. There's some constraints that I'm giving the system in order to sort of, and then we want it to sort of modify and adjust in order to figure out what that function in the middle is. Okay. That's the basis of this comic that I showed earlier. This is your machine learning system. You pour data into this big pile of linear algebra. So you pour X's into this big pile of just math that's in the middle of this black box. You get some answers on the other side. And if the answer is not what you're looking for, then you go start modifying stuff in the middle of your black box until the answers are what you're looking for. Okay. That just describes, it's a very general way of thinking about a task. Describes a lot of different tasks. So that's why we're going to use this as sort of a framing. And I will note that, like in the extreme example, we think about this thing. If I have, well, given this input, I want this output, and given this other input, given X1, I want Y1. Given X2, I want Y2 as my output. Given X3, I want Y3 as my output. One way I could build that is it's just a big lookup table, right? I could just have that black box just simply be, all right, take a look at the input. If the input is X1, then output Y1. If the input is X2, output Y2, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right? So that's sort of the trivial example of one way that we could build a system that, given some inputs, gives me some outputs. Given a picture of a cat, given this particular picture, you should output this is a cat. Given this other picture, you should output this is a dog. Given this other picture, you should output this is a cat. The difficulty with that approach is it's not really going to scale well. If I have a billion images, then that means my black box needs to store a billion images in it. And then when I give it an input, it's got to go and compare that input across every single one of those billion images, do a whole bunch of math, go, oh, here it is. This is the one. All right, what's the answer for this one? Oh, this is a cat. Right. So that sort of lookup table approach is not going to scale particularly well. The table ends up being sort of larger than the size of the universe for, if you really want it to work for lots and lots and lots of inputs. And the problem is it's also going to want, if I have a system like this, I want it to generalize to new inputs. So if I have a picture, if I have a system that's supposed to recognize, oh, is this picture a cat or a dog? I want it to work for new pictures. I don't want it to only work on the pictures that I had before. If I give it a new picture, then I want it to be able to figure out, is it a cat or a dog? So it needs to be able to generalize to new inputs. Okay, so that's our sort of, anyway, that's one way to sort of frame things. And as we're going to see throughout the course, a lot of these tasks that we looked at back here can, interestingly, be framed in that sort of way. Okay. All right. Let's finish off today with just some sort of basic terminology that's just going to come up over and over again, so we should sort of have it to start with. That sort of task that I just described of, here's a picture, is it a cat or a dog? That's a classification task. So this tends to be a situation where I have a bunch of inputs. I've got a bunch of sort of category labels. This is a dog, this is a cat, this is a dog, this is a cat. And what I'm going to do is I want it, if I give it a new image, it should give me a label. This ends up being sort of an instance of what's called supervised learning, in that I have examples of input-output pairs. So I have, when I'm building my model, I have, for this image of a dog, the output that I want is dog. For this image of a cat, the output that I want is cat. So I have, I'm supervising the system. I'm telling it what answers there should be for each of these inputs. This is a lot of what a lot of situations that we're going to be doing AI in. This is a situation where, hey, look, I know what task I want this to do. Given this input, I want this output. Given this input, I want, given that I, here's a picture of an X-ray, a medical diagnostic X-ray, and I want, for this picture, you should say that, this particular ailment is present, or no ailment is present. Right? And I'm going to have some data from people who have gone and labeled these things, and I can use that to train up my system. One issue with that sort of class of task is, it can be very expensive to get these labels. And of course, then there's always also the question of, what's the accuracy of this? But what's the accuracy here? For these 4 pictures, we're relatively sure that those categories are right. There's going to be potentially ambiguous cases. What do we do? Or what if, when the people have been labeling these things, they get some of them wrong? Anyway, issues. But a lot of sort of uses of AI will fall into this sort of category. Slightly more general than that is, hey, well, same system where we've got a bunch of inputs, but the output doesn't have to be a category label, right? So it doesn't have to be just, labeled as dog or cat. Here's an example where I have a bunch of data. This is sort of one of the standard test data sets, and it's a bunch of data on descriptions of a diamond, and then the output is supposed to be, what's the price that people put on this diamond? Okay. Again, same sort of task. I've got a bunch of inputs. I've got a desired output, but the desired output is a numerical value rather than a category label. Okay. So this gets closer. Sometimes people will call this just function approximation. Sometimes people will call this sort of task a regression task, which is sort of a hint as to what the sort of first approach that we'll use to try to solve this sort of task. Again, it's an example of supervised learning. We have the same problems. It can be expensive to get these sorts of values. If we want this system to work well, we've somehow got to gather all of this data, which again is also going to have these accuracy problems. But sort of standard situations. We don't always have these sorts of input-output pairs, though. Sometimes we just have, here's a bunch of inputs. Do something to it. So this ends up being called unsupervised learning. So we're not giving it explicit, these are my desired outputs. We're just more saying, try to come up with some outputs that are somehow useful. And so if I, give it a whole bunch of pictures like the ones there on the left, does it come up on its own with like, I can put these into 2 categories, and some of them are cats and some of them are dogs. Maybe it'll put it in other categories. Maybe it'll say, here's pictures taken during the daytime, and here's pictures taken, that are kind of darker, or close-ups versus, pictures of a whole animal. There's all sorts of different ways, different groups that those could be happening. One way to sort of visualize that is, so the data on the right, so each of these points is one input, and the input just consists of 2 values. The x-axis and the y-axis are the 2 values. Given that data being given to a system, when I look at that data, I'm like, okay, look, there's 3 groups. Right? There's very clearly 3 groups. How do we get an AI system to do the same, to do that same thing? Just automatically take some data and organize it like that. Okay? And then, of course, how do we even know if those are useful groups? But it's a separate question. That's called unsupervised learning. And this particular task of taking data and dividing it into groups ends up being called a clustering task. Okay. There's other sorts of unsupervised learning tasks where it's things more like, all right, here's a bunch of data. This is the same data as before, the diamond data set. There's like a whole bunch, like this list just goes on and on and on. There's a whole bunch of data here. I'd like to sort of like visually plot this in some way so that sort of vaguely the inputs that are near each other are vaguely near each other on my plot, just so that I can see, are there groups in this data or something like that. So I want to take this data that is, what is this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-dimensional data, and I want to compress it down to 2-dimensional data so that I can just plot it on a scatter plot like they're on the right. So it's called dimensionality reduction. Again, we get this interesting question of, well, fine, how do we know if that's a useful way of organizing things? So another example of unsupervised learning, because we're not really telling it exactly what the correct output is for any of the inputs. It's more, please find me some sort of structure in this data. Okay. What else have we got? Sort of somewhat intermediate between those. So semi-supervised, just as sort of terminology. Since getting labeled data is hard and expensive, sometimes you're in situations where you're like a bit of a mixture of both. Maybe I've got tons of data and people have only labeled part of it. So that's also a situation, sort of a mixture of supervised and unsupervised. There's also situations where it's supervised, but it's sort of, there isn't a big expense in getting this labeling, in that the task that we're trying to do is such that the desired output is really obvious from the data. For example, if I have data about stock market prices over some period of time, and if I want to build a model that says, hey, given sort of the previous 10 years of a stock value, tell me what it will be next, right? Well, if I've got like the last 100 years or whatever of data, I can just pull that out of the data. Okay, given this, given this sequence of data, whatever the next one is, that's the prediction. Similarly with text, given the previous 10 words, predict what the next word should be. Okay, so it's a situation. It's a supervised situation. So it's the same sort of, okay, given this input, here's the output. But there are situations where it's not difficult to gather that output data, so we don't have to go to extra effort to label the data. Okay. So that ends up being a sort of a special case of supervised that's sort of importantly different. And then this will come up. So it's also worth pointing out, everything I've talked about so far has sort of been in terms of, whenever I give the system feedback about what it should be doing, that's in terms of telling it what the correct output is. That's not necessarily the case. So for example, in sort of these game playing situations, I can't sort of, okay, given this board situation, here's what the correct move is. Or at least, maybe that's not necessarily the best way to do things, because, hey, maybe we don't know what the best move is to do next. Instead, we want it to learn it, and the only feedback that we give is sort of like, well, did you win the game or not? Okay. So that's a very different sort of feedback. So we put that in a different category. We call that reinforcement learning. But it's still, the whole point is still, given some input, the current situation, produce some output, what action to take. But we've got a very different sort of feedback coming at it. So we've got to figure out a different way to learn. All right. And yes, as the diagram there on the right is indicating, this is meant to be a little bit closer to how animals and people and living creatures learn. You tend not in real life to have people telling you explicitly, here's exactly what you should have done in each circumstance. You instead sort of get feedback every now and then. So, for instance, this particular rat, we're giving it a positive reward when it gets the cheese. And hopefully it'll learn. Cool. All right, there's our situation. Overall vague summary of all this. Artificial intelligence can mean just a lot of different things. And a lot of the excitement in modern AI really does center around deep neural networks. The exciting results over the last 5, 6, 7, 10 years are very focused on those domains. In order to understand that, though, we need to, I think, know where it all comes from. What are the fundamental concepts? How far can you go with the fundamentals? There's a lot of things you can do that do not require deep neural networks. And indeed, the deep neural network stuff only really starts working if you have billions of data points, and you don't always have that. And so we want to make sure that we show that you can go pretty far. Like what things can you do with these fundamentals? We're going to talk more about the course. And then we're also going to want to say, okay, well, what insights do these fundamentals give us on what's going on in modern AI? And the way that we're going to be approaching all of this throughout the course is we're going to frame a lot of these AI tasks in terms of this function approximation. Given some input, there's some output we want, but we don't really know what that internal function is. We've got to derive it, learn it somehow, and there's going to be a whole bunch of different techniques, depending on whether we're a situation that is supervised, unsupervised, reinforcement learning, semi-supervised, and so on. All right, so that's our plan for the course, and we will see how this all goes. I will continue to post these video versions to the internet, and we will see. Yeah, I hope it's useful, and I'm excited to see how this all goes. We'll see you next time.